And now I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Colarrossi, who is Vice President, Product Line Management, Innovation and Sustainability at Avery Dennison Apparel Solutions. Mike is the driving force behind the company's $1.2 billion retail branding and information solutions division, and he has been instrumental in driving a culture of innovation in the company. He has led the development of Avery Dennison's 2025 sustainability goals and the retail branding and information solutions global experience centers, which will launch in Italy, Norway, and Taiwan. Mike is a chemical engineer, and he has an MBA from Duke's Fuqua School of Business, and he's also fluent in Mandarin Chinese. So I'd like to say, Hua Ying Mike. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mike Colarrossi.
So good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. And Lerzan, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. So I am sometimes a little IT challenged, but let me see if I can do that. So you should now be seeing my screen, hopefully. Before getting started, I just want to say thank you to the Gabelli School of Business, and in particular to Donna, yourself, Lerzan, and to Cara and Frank, who were able to connect us all for this opportunity for me to speak with you all. So I'm really very pleased to be here. And of course, congratulations to all of the award recipients. You represent a group of companies that have become the symbols of innovation within industry, but also within pop culture. And I think you all should be very proud of this recognition. Before getting started, I don't know how many of you know Avery Dennison. So I would like to just give you a little bit of background, and then we can dive into some of my key remarks. Avery Dennison is a global material science company that specializes in the design and manufacturing of materials for labeling and other functional materials. So our products are used in nearly every industry, from fast-moving consumer goods to apparel, to the IT industry for bonding activities, to automotive for sound dampening, to our RFID division, which is used across all of retail. As an organization, Avery Dennison, very honestly, is several orders of magnitude smaller than many of the organizations that are represented here today. So I have to admit that when Lerzan asked me to give this keynote address, my first thought was, I'm not exactly certain what I'm going to be able to say to these leaders that, frankly, I often look up to, that you haven't already. So very honestly, I haven't still answered that question. So today, as much as I'm going to speak to you all as leaders of these amazing and impressive organizations, I'm also going to be speaking to the students who are going to be leading these organizations in the future, the faculty who are going to be working with these students to make sure that they have the skills to do that in the future. But also, very honestly, I'm going to be speaking to myself, just as a reminder of the things that I need to be doing to drive innovation within my organization. So let me start with a story about my childhood, but first a question to all of you. I'm curious if anyone would know what these two items on the screen have in common: plastic wrap and a saucer. I'm going to give you maybe 2 seconds. Unfortunately, we're not able to sort of use the chat function today, but just feel free to just contemplate that for a second, because the reality is that for most people, these two objects probably have absolutely nothing in common. But for me, they hold a special place in my heart, and they actually were maybe the first indication of what innovation could mean as a child. So my grandmother, who I will be very honest with you, most would argue that she was the definition of frugal. We were very much the family that was known to wash our disposable cups and utensils so that we could make certain that we reused them, at every holiday meal or every family gathering. So she knew how to pinch a penny, no doubt. But she never used plastic wrap in her entire life, particularly to protect food or any leftovers that were from the previous night's dinner. And why was that? It was because that instead of using that as a technique to preserve or to protect her food, she simply placed them in a bowl and put a saucer on top of the bowl to seal it shut. Simple, efficient, cost-effective, and oddly enough, it really had a profound impact on me about looking at a problem and thinking through it differently and how do you innovate a different solution to it. Now, by the classic definition of innovation, which I think we all know sort of largely focuses on new things or new experiences, my grandmother's solution, however ingenious it was, would probably not qualify as innovation. I think that's a very narrow view, frankly, especially if we start off by considering the problem that we're trying to solve. And yet in many organizations, innovation is often the remit of a specific team or function, and we all miss the amazing innovation that occurs organically through ingenuity, through looking at a problem in a different way and trying to solve it. And so because of that, I believe and I suggest that there's a different definition of innovation, and we need to pivot away from the idea of just creating new things to really thinking about creating new value. And in creating new value, we may actually extend the life of the things that we already have, because in many ways, do we really need more stuff? Or do those things that we already have simply need to deliver more or different value to us? Furthermore, as we think about broadening that definition of innovation and recognizing that ingenuity that occurs out of necessity is also innovation, we can empower anyone to be an innovator in our organizations. As innovators, we have a tendency to get caught up in, frankly, our own hype. I know I do, focusing on the technology versus the actual solution. And so what I always say to sort of young innovators is, if you ever want to see a great example of ingenuity in practice, innovation in practice, it's spend some time with an operator in a manufacturing environment who on a daily basis is creating new solutions to make their jobs just a little bit more effective. And I actually think about my grandmother in those situations of placing a saucer on top of it wasn't some crazy idea. It was just a simple way for her to solve a problem that she had in an incremental fashion. And so I would suggest that pragmatism, which sometimes we often frown upon, is especially when it's focused on solving a problem, really is innovation. And going back to my grandmother's example and her ingenuity here, just think about this. There is now 6.2 million cubic yards of plastic wrap in landfills in the United States today. That's equivalent of around 600,000 dump trucks, which if you lined them up, would be able to span the space between New York City and roughly Denver, Colorado. So there's billions of dollars going into addressing plastic waste. We all know that, and many of our organizations are involved in it. But actually, if we started off with what's the problem first, why are we using plastic? I wonder what would happen if everyone would actually just put a saucer on top of it. How much waste would we actually eliminate from our system? Now, sticking with the idea of history, let me tell you a little bit about Avery Dennison's history. So Ray Stanton was the founder of Avery Dennison. We know him as Stanton. He invented the world's first self-adhesive label. And that was a way to merchandise objects. That was what he was trying to accomplish. He started the company with a $100 loan. And over the past 86 years, we have grown that one single idea into a global Fortune 500 company that continues to advance quality and innovation in material science, particularly in the space of materials and label materials. Now, most of our organizations were created by a similar brave entrepreneurial spirit with a single great idea. And we often hold these people up as titans of industry and innovation. But as organizations grow and we start to feel the pressures of being a large organization, whether that is the quarterly earnings calls, the shareholder demands, other external pressures that we all feel, the natural tendency is for process and structure to replace entrepreneurism and risk-taking. And furthermore, those people who are involved in innovation and bringing these ideas to life are often put somewhere in an organization. We often label it research and development, and sometimes they get lost. And so when you think about history, when you think about the history of an organization, history matters. It matters not from the perspective of reliving our pasts or revisiting our past, from recalling the ideas of entrepreneurism, the excitement, the energy that spurred our organizations in the earliest days. It's the stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning. I think it probably gets many of you out of bed in the morning, and it makes us feel like we're making a difference, and it helps keep our teams, our employees engaged in solving some of the most challenging problems our businesses and our world faces. But history also matters from the perspective of learning from our past failures and striving to be better. Let's be honest, failure should be going part and parcel with innovation. We don't often like to talk about failure in large organizations, but it really does. If you're not failing in innovation, you're probably not leaning forward far enough. And so don't forget your history, including the failures. Embrace it, learn from it, be a product of it, and use it to reignite or even protect that entrepreneurial spirit that is the lifeblood of all innovation. Now, shifting to Avery Dennison a little bit more, this is an example on the screen of something that we manufacture. It is a price ticket that hangs off of a garment. Now, I would ask, when you purchase a new piece of clothing, how many of you spend more than a couple of seconds looking at this piece of paper or this piece of film that's hanging off your garment? I'd wager a pretty good part of my salary suggesting that many of you don't even bother. You quickly grab your scissors, snip it off, and throw it away in the trash or hopefully the recycling bin. What's interesting is that this little tag has transformed an industry. And it's probably impacted many, if not all, of the people in this audience, and it's going to continue to do so. And it was through the innovation of making these tags more intelligent. It was by adding a QR code that you see on this, or adding RFID into this paper tag, that Avery Dennison has made these labels intelligent. And by bringing intelligence to this tag, we created an opportunity for apparel brands around the world and their retailers to track their goods and understand where they were in their supply chains. So first of all, that's helped them get inventory visibility, which has helped them to reduce their supply chain waste. So a great addition to our efforts in sustainability. It's also enabled what's called omni-channel supply chains. So being able to supply demand from multiple locations because you know exactly where your goods are sitting at any point in that supply chain. And now what it's doing, it's actually enabling all of the buy online, pick up in store activities and models that are now out there, particularly driven by the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you have participated in. Now, looking forward, this tag and other labels like it are going to be able to use to create a unique digital ID to anything that is attached to it. Through that unique ID, we will start to deliver information that improves the transparency of the supply chain. It'll tell consumers and recyclers alike how to recycle their goods. It's going to enable reselling networks and take-back schemes. It will allow consumers and brands to validate the authenticity of a good. And it's also going to allow brands to engage with consumers beyond the point of sale. So this little tag that many of us ignore has really transformed an industry, and it will continue to do so. So my message to you here is, don't ignore the small stuff. When we think about the huge innovations and we think about the big products that we're putting in front of consumers, some of these very small things have tremendous outsized impact on industries and on supply chains. Now, let me finally conclude my remarks here with a request to all of you. Many of your organizations have created products or services that I frankly never knew that I needed. And some may even argue that I probably don't even need them today. So first, let me say thank you. I think it's amazing. And I think you've made certainly my life a lot more enjoyable and better. So thank you very much. But let me challenge you on the purpose of your innovation. You know, I was very pleased in talking to Lerzan to learn that the American Innovation Index is also recognizing innovation that benefits society and the environment. That's because I fundamentally believe that innovation has the power to do good, and that as innovators in some of the world's largest organizations with the most resources at our disposal, we have an obligation to unleash the power of that innovation. So my question to you is, how are you harnessing your internal innovation to solve some of the world's most challenging problems? If a little label can have such a large impact, just imagine the opportunity to do good that your solutions may have. The challenges that we are grappling with today as a society, whether that is racial and gender inequity, climate change, systemic poverty, childhood hunger, the list is unfortunately far too long to mention. It's going to require radical partnership to solve it. So my next question to you is, how actively are you partnering with other stakeholders to address those challenges? So again, congratulations to everyone. I hope you all enjoy your conference. And just remember, there's tremendous activity and tremendous support for what you're doing. But also remember, there's still much to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. You know that you're preaching to the choir here. So we do have a few questions in our chat, and one of them, you know, I definitely have been asking that question quite a bit as well. And that is, you know, incremental innovations are clearly essential, but innovation ultimately needs to be recognized by customers if it is to differentiate a company. And the AII, the Social Innovation Index, is exactly that, right? It measures to what extent the customers are perceiving the social innovativeness of these brands. So how can managers communicate these innovations in ways that resonate with customers? Have you seen any best practices? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, at Avery Dennison, we start with insights. What's happening in industry? What is happening in the broader ecosystem? What's happening with consumers? And trying to then determine how that impacts our customers, and then ultimately the solutions that we provide. In doing that, what we always talk about is value. What value are we going to create for our customers? What problem are we addressing for them? What new opportunity are we generating for them? And so when we present our solutions, both externally and internally, we don't talk about the product. The product is the vehicle. What we talk about is the value that we're going to generate for our customer, the value we're going to generate for our organization. And the more that we can practice that, what we've seen is that we actually get better uptake internally as an organization. People it starts to click a little bit more of the why, the bigger why. But also when we go out into the market to try to sell these activities, the selling cycle becomes much more efficient. It's much less friction because you are talking about the value that you're creating for a brand or for a customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Here is a related but slightly different question. It's about the importance of engaging with different stakeholders. So the note says, frequently, however, different stakeholders want different things. For example, communities versus investors, which may sometimes not be in balance, right, in their trade-offs. So how do you see balancing the needs of these stakeholders within an organization?
So absolutely correct. There's always a trade-off, and there's always different requirements from different groups. What we do, and what I would always suggest, is start with your values as an organization. What is your position? And you start there, and you don't sacrifice those values. Then it becomes a question of, what role do you want to play? So Avery Dennison, because of where we sit in the supply chain, we're actually pretty fortunate, because we have to work with brands, we have to work with factories, we have to work with our broader supply chain to actually make our solutions come to life. So if you can be that point of bringing different views together and be that point of collaboration, you actually will find that there's probably more commonality than there is difference. But it is finding those common threads and trying to unlock those if you're in the fortunate position like we are at Avery Dennison.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you mentioned supply chain. So that's something that we think about a lot as well, especially sustainability in the supply chain. What, in your opinion, are some of the challenges or the opportunities when it comes to sort of sustainability in the supply chain? So would love your thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, the question was, what are the challenges?
Yeah, what are some of the challenges to make a more sustainable supply chain? I mean, I know there's a lot, but maybe you can pick like the top three.
I would say the biggest one right now is just visibility of data and being able to share that data across the supply chain from source to a consumer. The data exists. The problem is that it exists in different formats. It's not shared on a common platform. And so as a result, it's very hard to get a single view. Now, there's lots of work trying to, whether it's blockchain solutions or other industry platforms, but I would say that is just the access to that data is, I think, is the first challenge. I think the second challenge that we're really experiencing, I think, right now is the resiliency of supply chains, and then what does that mean economically? So I'll use the apparel industry as a great example. Decades ago, the apparel industry moved to low-cost labor countries. And I'll be honest, the apparel industry does not have a great track record when it comes to transparency of their supply chain or even labor practices. The dilemma that we have, and the dilemma the industry has, that the apparel industry is often the first into developing economies. And they are a net job creator, and they actually are lifting organizations out of poverty. Now, as we talk about supply chain resiliency, we're talking about moving things back and around the world and changing things. The dilemma now is, well, what happens if we move things from very low wage countries where the country itself is reliant upon it, and where maybe the practices aren't that great, but we're moving it back to the United States, we're moving it back to Western Europe. What does that mean? Supply chain resiliency may get better, it may be more efficient, you're closer to source, but all of a sudden, have you actually done better by that local economy where you're pulling jobs out, or are you making the situation worse? So that's a dilemma that we're facing as an industry of how do you get that balance right? And ultimately, it's going to come down to, I think, us as consumers making a decision around, are we going to vote with our wallet when it comes to some of these issues? Are we going to vote with our wallet when it comes to labor practices? Or are we more interested in getting, a t-shirt that costs $5.99?
Yeah, and you mentioned something that I know our students are very interested in, and we have a lot of students who are listening in today about blockchain and technology and how it's going to disrupt and how we run our supply chains. Would you be able to speak to a little bit about that, of how you see that transformation happening?
So there's a lot of buzz around blockchain. I've not seen yet very many strong applications of it for the purposes of transparency. I know it's still a space that we're looking at. There is more value in it for authenticity in particular. I would go back to saying that the first step is around integrity and access to the data. And right now, we aren't there yet. So before you can start posting to blockchain, you need to understand what data you need to capture. There needs to be a common standard of how you capture it, and then it can be posted. So I see blockchain as a potential tool once the basics are in place. There is still a lot of work to do on the basics around getting access to data in a way that can scale. And whether that is going to be ERP systems IoT devices. I think there'll be many technology advances to make that happen. There's even projects right now about integrating technology into things like cotton to make certain that we can track it all the way back to source. But I would say that technology will have a major role to play, particularly over the next 5 years, as we figure out what are those solutions to get access and get our hands on that data that we need.